Welcome to Israel Now News. I'm Erin Viner.
And I'm Rebecca Rand.
In our top story, hundreds of rockets fired by Hamas in Gaza have rained down on Jewish civilian communities in southern Israel. The violence comes despite the terror group's promise of calm after receiving $15 million of a pledged $90 million cash influx from Qatar. The Hamas-run enclave has been in upheaval after its leaders invested in terror rather than infrastructure, and an internal conflict with the Palestinian Authority left them unable to pay the wages of municipal employees. Israel ultimately allowed Qatar to intervene and pay the outstanding salaries in exchange for peace on the Gaza border. Just 2 days after the transfer, however, Hamas fired hundreds of rockets into Israel. Schools in the Gaza border communities were canceled for several days as Israeli families huddled in their bomb shelters. The rocket fire began just hours after one Israeli soldier was killed and another injured during a mission to Gaza when an elite special forces unit came under fire by Hamas militants.
The state of Israel will help America enforce its crippling sanctions against the world's largest state sponsor of terror. Just weeks after President Trump reinstated the harshest sanctions against Iran, Israeli officials said that the Jewish state will continue providing intelligence to ensure that the rogue Islamic Republic feels the full weight of the American sanctions. Israel's UN ambassador Danny Danon told the United Nations that Europe and other countries must join the United States in order to create a united front for the stability of the Middle East and the world at large. He said from today, the world will have to choose a side, the United States or Iran.
Leaders of the Polish government marched alongside far-right nationalists as they brandished fascist symbols during the country's Independence Day celebrations. Poland's prime minister, president, and several other leaders walked alongside racist members of the far-right groups as they carried flags for the National Radical Camp. This is the first time that Polish leaders have joined the nationalists. Until now, the groups have held separate marches, which are notorious for racist chanting, fascism, and violence.
Israeli security services prevented nearly 500 terror attacks this year. The director of Israel's intelligence service, or Shin Bet, briefed the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, saying that his agency is working overtime to prevent bloodshed. Nadav Argaman said that Hamas is trying very hard to carry out terror attacks in and from Judea and Samaria. He said that over the past year, we were able to thwart 480 terror attacks, including 219 Hamas cells and 590 lone attackers. Argaman said that in addition, Shin Bet has also been able to foil multiple cyber attacks and espionage plots against Israel. He concluded by saying that intensive efforts by the Israeli police, the IDF, and Shin Bet allow Israelis to live their daily lives in peace.
A Jerusalem judge has made a precedent-setting decision which will enable any Jew to sue for damages in an Israeli court. Judge Moshe Drori ruled in favor of two women who were held hostage by PLO terrorists on the Achille Lauro cruise ship in 1985. His decision is based on Israel's recently passed nation-state law, which stipulates that the Jewish state is responsible for ensuring the well-being of its citizens, as well as those of Jewish origin who have been affected by anti-Semitism. The original lawsuit was filed against the PLO in the year 2000 by two of the survivors of the hostage standoff, where a wheelchair-bound man was murdered by being shot and thrown overboard because he was Jewish. The plaintiffs have since passed away, but the Israeli legal powerhouse Sharat Hadin continued fighting in their names and for the sake of all Jews who have been targeted for their faith. The group's founder, Nitzana Darshan-Leitner, praised the ruling, saying that it proves that even after 33 years, the State of Israel will bring justice to persecuted Jews worldwide.
The Islamic State has claimed credit for a terrorist attack in Australia. According to authorities, a 30-year-old Somali man who had been radicalized by ISIS propaganda set fire to a truck loaded with gasoline canisters in the middle of Melbourne. He stabbed one person before being shot by Aussie police. Newly elected Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison spoke bluntly about the attack, saying that radical, violent extremist Islam opposes our very way of life.
American-Israeli terror victim Ari Fold was posthumously honored by the Israeli police for his exceptional heroism. Fold was fatally stabbed in the back by a Palestinian terrorist, but managed to pursue and neutralize his attacker before he could harm anyone else. In a moving ceremony, Ari Fold was awarded the Israeli Police Civil Medal of Distinction. The official commendation was given to Fold's family in the presence of Israel's Public Security Minister Gilad Erdan, Police Commissioner Roni Al-Sheikh, and President Reuven Rivlin. 52 police officers were also decorated for their performance and heroism by thwarting terror attacks and saving lives.
The Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, has asked the Council to condemn Hezbollah's construction of several weapons factories in the center of Beirut. In a letter addressed to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Danon wrote that Hezbollah has deliberately placed its missile production sites in the heart of large civilian population centers in Beirut, with the aim of using them as human shields for its malicious military activity. Danon said that these actions clearly contradict Security Council resolutions, and he urged the United Nations to condemn the blatant violations.
Pope Francis has come out against the rise of anti-Semitic attacks and has said that Christians cannot hate Jews. The pontiff stressed that Jews and Christians share the same roots and that anti-Semitism is a contradiction of faith and life. He then called on Christians to commit themselves to ensure that anti-Semitism is banned from the human community.
An Israeli women's water polo team traveled all the way to Barcelona before they were informed that they were unwelcome to participate in the European Water Polo Championship hosted in Malins de Rey. The municipality cited pressure from the anti-Israel boycott, divest, and sanction movement and informed the Israeli team that they were unwanted in their city. The Spanish Water Polo Association offered the Israeli team to compete in another venue without an audience, but the Israeli athletes refused and demanded that they be treated as equal members of the competition. The match was ultimately relocated to another venue that was willing to host Israelis.
A peaceful memorial service was interrupted by Arabs screaming "Death to the Jews." The vigil was held on the eve of the anniversary of Kristallnacht, the night that Nazi soldiers destroyed Jewish homes, schools, businesses, and synagogues throughout Germany and Austria. A few dozen Jews gathered in London's Hyde Park to light candles for the victims of Kristallnacht and to raise awareness of the hundreds of Jews killed during the same period in Arab pogroms. According to witnesses, the ceremony was interrupted by Arabs screaming "Death to the Jews" and "Remember Khaybar," in reference to the massacre of the ancient Jewish community of Saudi Arabia by Muslim armies. The Jewish mourners were unable to honor their dead and forced to call off the vigil before it became violent.
A German NGO has rescinded its humanitarian award to the Women's March for its hardcore anti-Semitism and support of BDS efforts against Israel. Several celebrities and public figures have also come out against the organization for its ties to an outspoken anti-Semite. The Women's March, headed by Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory, has been shaken to its core over their support of the leader of Nation of Islam, who has repeatedly said that all Jews are termites and has called for the destruction of Israel. Several key speakers have dropped out, saying that the leaders must denounce Louis Farrakhan, but the organizers themselves have made repeated statements against Jews in Israel. Tamika Mallory has praised Hamas terrorists for what she called their brave use of human shields, and Linda Sarsour has called on the international community not to humanize Israelis.
The Israeli Air Force has announced that it's found the remains of an airman missing since 1962. According to a statement by the IDF spokesman's office, the body of missing pilot Yakir Mordechai Nave was found after 56 years of searching in the Sea of Galilee. Nave's plane crashed in the lake on May 6th of 1962. The body of his co-pilot, Cadet Oded Cotton, was recovered a year later, but it took hundreds of man-hours to finally recover the remains of Lieutenant Nave. The late pilot's family was notified, and a funeral was held for him last week in Tel Aviv.
It's getting chilly outside, which means that thousands of cranes and other birds are migrating through Israel to North Africa. According to wildlife experts, every year more than 500 million birds visit Israel's Hula Valley, which is situated in the center of the Afro-Syrian Rift. The Agamon Hula Park is home to 400 bird species and is a temporary resting place for 35,000 cranes on their way to Ethiopia and Sudan. The Hula Valley is one of Israel's most remarkable places. Located just east of the Golan Heights, the wildlife preserve is known as a paradise for birds and people.
Israeli startup companies raised a record $600 million last month. So far this year, startups in the Jewish state have raised $4.5 billion, and economists believe that they will surpass last year's record of $5.24 billion. Israel's known as the startup nation, and these numbers prove that financiers continue to believe that the country is one of the best places to invest.
The Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel recently celebrated the ancient festival of Sigd, the holiday that commemorates the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai and the renewal of the covenant made between God and Israel. Tens of thousands of members of Beta Israel ascended to a spot overlooking the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to pray and thank God for their return to Zion. Sigd is a holiday exclusive to the Ethiopian Jewish community. It's marked by fasting and praying for peace, and it concludes with a festive meal, music and dancing, and a parade throughout the streets of Jerusalem.
Tourism to the Jewish state continues to increase and break all the previous records. This past October, 485,500 people visited the Jewish state, contributing 2.5 billion shekels to the Israeli economy. That's a 14% increase over the same month last year. Jerusalem has seen a drastic increase in the number of visiting Europeans, and 300,000 came in October alone. The Ministry of Tourism believes that the rise is due to the introduction of low-cost airlines operating no-frills flights to the Jewish state. So far this year, 3.4 million tourists have visited Israel, marking a 15% increase over last year. The Tourism Ministry says that it aspires to host 4 million tourists in 2019, and we here at Israel Now News would like to invite all of our viewers to visit us
next year in Jerusalem. That concludes the news portion of our show. Stay tuned for Ask the Source with Josh Reinstein.
Hello and welcome to Ask the Source. I'm your host Josh Reinstein, and we're here on a beautiful day on our rooftop studio in Jerusalem. My guest today is Michael Sullivan. He's the CEO of Empower Texans. Michael, thanks for being on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, what brings the CEO of Empower Texans all the way here to Jerusalem?
Well, it's always great to spend some time with, in the other Lone Star State, to visit with folks who are as passionate about self-governance as we like to be in Texas.
We see so much camaraderie with Texas. You just mentioned we're the other Lone Star State, but a lot of the support that we're seeing economically and biblically is actually coming out of Texas. The network Daystar, where we're broadcast, is out of Texas. Why is there such an affinity?
I think there's an affinity for a couple of reasons. So first, of course, you've got the fact that we're both strong trading partners with each other. The relationship we have, it's funny when you look at a map and you see the lines of longitude. Texas and Israel tend to line up pretty nicely together. So a lot of geography and that sort of culture, and certainly the independent spirit of both peoples. Politically, I think culturally, I think we have a lot in common.
So tell us a little about what does Empower Texans do?
Our organization focuses on trying to help citizens in the Lone Star State be more engaged in their government. We tend to believe that government works best when you have more people involved. In fact, I think that's an area where we could learn a lot from the people of Israel. I read recently where there's some complaints about only having 70% turnout in some elections a couple of years ago in the United States, and in Texas particularly. We look at somewhere around 40 to 50% turnout. We need more citizens engaged in government, not less.
Is there a real way for Empowered Texans to cooperate with the state of Israel?
I think that there is. One, I think we would like to help citizens. There are some tools that we've developed in helping citizens be more directly engaged with their government. We'd like to help folks do that in Israel, to give folks a greater sense of ownership of their government. I think as republics, the things that the United States and Texas has in common with Israel is that we believe that the people are in charge, and we'd like to help Israel do that the same way Israel has obviously helped the world in shining that light of law as the basis of government.
One of the things that were really interesting to me, and I went to the reception after the embassy moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, is not just how many Christians were there, but how many Texans were actually there. There were hundreds of people from Texas, mostly spiritual leaders. Why was it such an important thing for people of faith in Texas to come to the embassy move?
Yeah, I think that you can't get away from the fact that if you are a Bible-believing Christian, as I am, Israel has a very important role, not only in biblical prophecy and other things, but more importantly, just the way we're called to organize our lives. Our founding fathers in the United States took great inspiration for the way our government was established by reading the way God called for Israel to be established. And I think that particularly in Texas, where we are a more culturally conservative and politically conservative state, you have a lot of folks who are looking at those questions of how can we better organize ourselves to be more in line with the way God calls us to have our civil government rather than less.
We're seeing a real sea change in policy from the current administration for Israel. It's a lot more pro-Israel. It's a lot more involved in supporting Jerusalem as our undivided capital. Is this something seen very positively in Texas?
Oh, incredibly positively. I think you saw just in the past, in our last legislative session, the Texas legislature voted strongly for the anti-BDS, of course, the BDS movement being pushed by some bad folks around the world, and sadly picking up strength in the United States. But Texas said, no, we're not going to allow Texas tax dollars to be used to attack Israel. And that's a popular sentiment across the political aisle. When there's so much that divides us politically, you find support for Israel is a pretty common unifying force in Texas.
One of the things that we see is a lot of cooperation economically as well. The governor of Texas was here last year for water tech to find out about water technologies. Right. How does Israeli technology have a role in the economy of Texas? Well,
like Israel, Texas is a state that while wealthy in a lot of ways, one thing we don't have a lot of is water. And you can see the great strides and technology that have been made in Israel to purify water, to bring in salt water for potable uses. And that's a challenge that we have, a perennial challenge in Texas. The joke has always been in Texas that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. And I think that if we can do a little less fighting maybe by taking some of the good desal work that has been done and been pioneered actually in Israel and bring that into Texas. Of course, biotech and just general technology. Israel and Texas both have a lot of great leaders who are working together.
You have a very stable political system in Texas, also at the state level and also at the national level. How can you export that kind of technology to Israel?
Look, if we could figure that out, you and I could both be sitting on a beach somewhere with little drinks with umbrellas in them. The real key to political stability is citizen engagement. I'm absolutely convinced that the more citizens that we have actively involved in their government, whether you're in Israel or you're in Texas, the better off people are going to be.
One thing that we differ in is we don't have a separation of church and state in Israel. In fact, we believe the Bible is the reason we have a state here, and it's integral in our politics. How big is that difference in Texas? Is there a big separation of church and state there?
There is, and that's it's always that very fine line, in American government, American politics, idea of how much should you have, the union of church and state. Certainly, the concept of a separation of state doesn't appear in our Constitution. That was a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a church that was worried about the government being too involved in their church, not the other way around. And I think that the left has confused that over the years, or at least done their best to confuse it over the years. And the question in Texas, the question in the United States is not should the church be involved in government, but again, how much interference there be from the government into church, and that's always a good question of discussion.
Michael, there are literally tens of millions of people watching this show. What message do you have for our viewing audience?
One, first and foremost, we all have to be united in supporting Israel. Supporting Israel is the same as supporting liberty wherever you happen to live. And then I'll, like a good broken record, encourage folks to be more involved in their governments. The way we defeat tyranny is by being involved as citizens.
Thank you, Michael, for being on the show. And thank you for tuning in to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein. Now back to the studio.
Up next, the return to Zion with Karen Hayesode.
Shalom and welcome to the Return to Zion with Keren HaYesod United Israel Appeal. I'm Eliezer Moody Sandberg, World Chairman of Keren HaYesod, the leading official fundraising organization for the State of Israel. After 2,000 years, we found the descendants of the lost tribe of Dan. Please help us welcome our brothers and sisters back home. God bless you from Jerusalem.
In that day, the Lord will reach out his hand to reclaim the surviving remnant of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Cush, from Elam, from Babylonia, from Hamath, and from the islands of the Mediterranean. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11. Through their deep faith, Roy and Yuklin Chen, a devout Bible-believing Christian couple from Hong Kong, received a sign from heaven revealing their personal mission in life to help realize God's promise to return the exiled people of Israel back to their ancestral homeland. 1 year after the historic and inspirational journey to Ethiopia, Roy and Yuklin Chen have witnessed the prophetic vision gathering momentum through the continuation of the Ethiopian Jewish community's Aliyah to Israel. Within the last year alone, some 1,400 Ethiopians have returned to Israel through the assistance of Keren HaYesod, but many more have yet to complete their journey.
To have the whole prophecy being lived out right before us was simply overwhelming. Not only was it difficult to see the people in the camps waiting to go back to Israel, but when Father God gave us a message to share with them, which was simply that Abba, Father, has not forgotten them, that every one of them will be brought back to their homeland. And to use a couple that's living on the other side of the world, doesn't even know where Cush is or what Cush is, that's the length that Father will go to reach his children.
Roy and Yuklin came to Bangkok to an event hosted by the Friends of Israel of Keren HaYesod. They were joined by 1,500 Christian worshipers who gathered to help the fulfillment of the biblical prophecy come true.
Now Israel is 70 years old. It is time that we bring Israel home so that we can join to our brothers and be one new man.
We believe it is our privilege, each and every one of us, the Gentiles, to rally around our brothers and sisters in Israel and to take part in what the Lord has already set in motion.
Roy and Yuklin know that their mission has only just begun and are committed to making sure that all the remaining Ethiopian Jews are brought home to Israel.
The biggest blessing is not that, oh, if I give, then I will get financial reward. The biggest blessing is to know that your God is real and he keeps every one of his promises. And every promises is made to you is going to happen because he answered the prayers of his people and they are coming home, and you can be a part of it.
He will raise a banner from the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 12.
Together, we will bring all our brothers and sisters back to Jerusalem.
Now is the time to act. There is still so much more we can do. Join the Chens and Keren HaYesod in this fulfillment of the biblical prophecy.
Come join Keren HaYesod in fulfilling biblical prophecy. Let's bless Israel together.
To donate and get information, call us at 1-800-505-1665 or visit our website at www.khisrael.org.
The opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem on May 14th was widely criticized in the U.S. media and the world media as being a radical departure from long-standing American policy toward Israel in the Middle East. It was not. The departure from American policy was the 70 years in which the United States did not recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. For hundreds of years before 1948, America's attitude toward this land was that in order to be a great nation, America, in order for Americans to be good Christians and good citizens, they had to support the recreation of a Jewish state in this country, and the Jewish state with only one individual capital, the capital city of Jerusalem. That was the case in the early part of the 19th century, when Americans such as Harriet Livermore, Sarah Haight, John Turner Barclay came to Jerusalem, and they established colonies which had one purpose, and that was to teach the Jews how to regain their sovereignty in the land of Israel. And they made the colonies here for the purpose that Jerusalem would be the capital of that future state. America's first consul general in Jerusalem, Warder Cresson of Philadelphia, came to the city, in the Old City, in 1844. He immediately set up the American eagle over his doorway and said that the eagle's wing would protect the Jewish people and help ingather them to Israel and Jerusalem to recreate a Jewish state. Warder Cresson, who later converted to Judaism and became a leader of the Sephardic community here, buried on the Mount of Olives, was a symbol of America's commitment to Jerusalem as the capital of a reborn Jewish state. That same idea informed the policies of Abraham Lincoln, whose last words on earth was his wish to visit Jerusalem. He said it twice on the way to Ford's Theater. The deep and yearning of Woodrow Wilson and, of course, Harry Truman to see Israel recreated with Jerusalem as its capital. The opening of that embassy on May 14th was not a departure. The opening of the embassy on May 14th was an historic return.
Lift up your eyes and look around. All your children gather and come to you. The biblical prophecy is unfolding right before our very eyes. The people of Israel are returning to the Promised Land after 2,000 years of exile. But millions of Jews are still longing to come home. Anti-Semitism threatens many of the Jews. We must rescue them before the window of opportunity slams shut. Bless Israel by supporting Keren Hayesod United Israel Appeal, the leading official fundraising organization for the State of Israel. Together, we can fulfill the prophecy of the Bible.
Let us bless Israel together.
To donate and get information, call us at 1-800-505-1665 or visit our website at www.khisrael.org.
That's all for this edition of Israel Now News. I'm Erin Viner.
And I'm Rebecca Rand, reporting from our studio in Jerusalem. Please join us next week for all your Israel updates.